Hey, it's Alana here. Today's episode is the last one of the season. Thank you for being here, coming on the untangling journey, and I hope you gleaned your own untangling wisdom from these conversations. I want to say a special thank you to those who supported Untangled this season through your Patreon pledges. Your financial support meant the difference between this project going ahead this year or not. I'll be taking an open-ended break from Untangled as I head out to live in an eco-village in Vanuatu for a couple of months. At this stage, I'm unsure if Untangled will return for future seasons. This is something I will ponder out in the forest. Thank you so much for being here, and whether or not Untangled returns in the future, I want you to know it's been a true privilege to bring these stories to you.
Having a very sensual relationship with the natural world brought back that instinctive, wild nature within myself. I really identify that I had injured instincts, as do most of us growing up in a patriarchal culture. We haven't grown up having a mirror to ourselves of we are adequate the way we are. We are wild creatures who have sovereignty over ourselves and we know what we want and need at any time. So this was about relearning that this creature is wild at its essence and deconditioning the good girl and the perfectionist into more of an integrated woman.
Claire Dunn says her work as an environmental campaigner left her burnt out and disillusioned about humans' relationship with the natural world. So she quit her job, left her partner of 5 years and her house by the ocean, extracting herself from modern life to live in the Australian bush. While Claire learnt many skills to live off the land, built a shelter with her bare hands, navigated encounters with the wild creatures of the forest, I think what touched me most about Claire was her internal journey. Claire says she was addicted to achieving, doing, striving and proving her worth, and it was the forest that brought her back into the flow of her feminine. Claire eventually realised she was not there to just learn skills or to slow down, although that was definitely part of it, but she was there to learn how to be a woman again. Claire's book, My Year Without Matches, Escaping the City in Search of the Wild, is her memoir of this year-long forest retreat. I'm Alana Helbig, and you're listening to Untangled. Welcome, Claire. Thank you for joining me on Untangled. You grew up on a farm in New South Wales in Australia. Can you describe your childhood for us?
It was a working farm of sorts, more of a hobby farm. I grew up with my 4 siblings and my 2 parents in a convict-built, sprawling, big garden along the river, the Patterson River, just outside Maitland. In some ways, it was, one of the last generation of the free-range upbringing. Didn't have a lot of screen time, so there was a lot of outdoors. My parents are both gardeners, so we followed them around. And my 3 older brothers showed me the way. We had our cubbies down by the river and fishing, and we'd track bear and tiger in the paddock. And I had my own little magical relationship with the world. Like all kids, we use our imaginations to create a magical world around us. So I was making witch's brews in my cauldron, and when I think about it, it's kind of just the forerunner to the skills of living on the land. It just comes naturally as kids, so shelters and mud pies and herbal sandwiches and all that kind of thing. When I was a teenager, I just wanted to move to town so I could walk to my friend's place, but apart from that blip in time, I'm incredibly grateful to have grown up free range.
What were you taught about nature, the forest, the environment as a child? Paint us a picture of what role it played in your early childhood.
It was kind of implicit. My parents were not in any way what we would now think of as conservationists, and the landscape was quite clear. Being the Hunter Valley, it was cow country and farming country. So it wasn't like I was given much of an education in kind of ecology or Australian native forest. The kind of key to my love of nature started, though, with the permission I was given and the space I was given to have unstructured playtime in nature. Of course, it was just a given then. I'd get home from school, wolf down a Vegemite sandwich and then run outside. There wasn't any kind of stranger danger. There was no one within kilometres. It was really this kind of generation of unstructured playtime, which is so rare these days. There's some statistic around the range by which children are allowed to roam has decreased by 90%. Whereas I had paddocks and riverbanks and 150-year-old Moreton Bay fig trees to climb. So the education wasn't really a kind of an education. It was more my ability to connect, to run barefoot on the earth, to have the agility to climb trees, to be able to follow my own curiosity and intuition. That's what was cultivated and fostered. In many ways, my family was very politically conservative, but the values of living on the land was what really seeded my love of nature and of wide open spaces.
You originally studied journalism and writing at university, but sidelined into grassroots activism. Tell us the story of the very first time you attended a logging operation.
I was sent off to the Big Smoke to Sydney to go to university with the goal, certainly my parents' goal, and I thought it was my goal, to become a journalist. Instead, I found myself hanging out with University Green Society. Don't quite know how I ended up there. I just signed up, started getting the newsletters, and after a year I thought, I may as well go along to a meeting. Turned up to my first meeting and they were voting in the new coordinators and no one put up their hand, and my friend looked at each other and thought, why not? So we put up our hand, and that started a very steep learning curve of certainly the culture around environmental activism, but also the realities of our planet time, which I was completely ignorant to. I mean, I knew about the greenhouse effect and logging, but had no kind of real embodied understanding or any, significant concern. But early on in that journey, I was taken out to a logging operation, which actually was not far from where I grew up, which made it all the more shocking because the forest that had kind of been the backdrop to my childhood, the mountains on the edge of the valley that fed our water catchments. When I took a closer look, I remember standing on top of a stump of a brush box tree and looking out over virtually a clear fell, and this quite sudden embodied sense of what we're doing to the planet. It was all right there in front of me, in the smell, in the sight, in the knowledge that it's completely unsustainable. They're turning our diverse, incredibly rich forests into tree farms at the expense of the homes and habitats to all these creatures, not to say the pollution in our waterways, that knowing that we are existing in this time, this planet time of great ecological destruction. From then, it was a heartfelt desire to do something about it. It was that kind of youthful idealism and outrage that this was happening. It was absolutely my resolution to fix things. It was that outrage, that passion for justice that fueled the next phase of my life, which was all about that political activism and doing everything I could on a political level to bring change to the laws of destruction.
So you did a lot of volunteer grassroots activism after that I guess launched you into that kind of activism. Can you tell us some of your most prominent memories from that time, or one of your most prominent memories from that time?
The prominent feeling or felt sense of the time was one of camaraderie. Engaging in that type of environmental activism immediately puts you in a team environment where you're surrounded by other people who feel just as passionately about something as you do. And it's a purpose beyond self, a real feeling of living for something that's of great importance, getting up in the morning and having a strong sense of purpose and vision and drive that's shared by others, which is just one of the joys of life. So that sense of shared purpose and like a mission, like we're on an adventure together, we're on a mission. Sometimes it could have been seen as a bit of a righteous mission, traveling around the forest with a group of other earth lovers. What we were doing was green policing. So we were going into these logging operations and auditing them, which involved spending a lot of time in the forest, documenting and taking photos and getting to know the landscape, and then following it up with reports on transgressions of the law. So it involved both a lot of time outside and that sense of real purpose. Together, that creates quite a joyful life. And of course, also there's the dramatic periods of blockading and conflicts, or the times where we really put ourselves on the line in order to save forests, which were incredibly powerful and life-changing for me too. I remember one time it was my turn to climb the tree sit. And tree sit's about 30 or 40 metres above ground. And it's just this kind of basically a pallet that's swinging from a branch, that I stayed up there for 24 hours. And it was terrifying and exhilarating, and I could still feel that sense of feeling so vulnerable and yet so powerful. Just existing up in the canopy of a old growth tree in northern New South Wales is an experience I'll never forget.
Yeah, something that most of us would never get to experience. Eventually you took a job as the campaign manager for the Wilderness Society in Newcastle. I imagine that must have been a bit of a change for you, going from being out on the grassroots level and then moving into more of that corporate office environment. Did it feel like it was the perfect job for you at the time, like it was ticking all of the boxes?
It certainly felt like an amazing opportunity to be paid for something that I was already doing voluntarily. And it also felt a recognition of the skill set that I had developed. I felt good at my job. I had studied communications and I was really adept with working with the media and communicating a message with potency and passion. You know, I also felt like I could stand my own in the corridors of power and with the politicians. And I loved working with the community. It was an amazing opportunity, but it certainly was a shift from that communality of the grassroots activism into more of a structured paid position, part of a large national organisation, which meant a lot more time on the computer and administratively and dealing with governance, and finding myself less and less out in the forest, and also setting myself apart from everyone else who was still a volunteer. There was this sense of separateness or pressure or isolation that started to creep in, and also the expectations of having this precious job and the expectation of doing twice the hours that I was paid for, essentially. When I started working on national campaigns like the Tasmanian Forest campaign, which I was working on for one federal election, but I wasn't in the forest, I was in a different state, and it started to feel quite abstract. I had been down there, but it wasn't a place I knew well, so I was talking about areas, trying to inspire people who lived in a completely different part of Australia to care about little furry creatures that lived on an island in another part of the continent. It began to feel like a bit more of a stretch. I wasn't talking from my own embodied love of that place. I was talking from what I'd been told and read, and it wasn't as powerful. It wasn't coming from that powerful place within me. What I came to see was that unless people had a love of a place, unless people had a genuine connection with the wild world anywhere, you know, like even the love of some place close to them could then spill over into the love of the wild places anywhere. But without that intimate connection, statistics and facts about disappearing species just kind of bounced off them. There wasn't really anywhere for it to land and to feel real. So I came to see that it was really the real work was around healing that disconnection, healing that rift of separation that us in the Western world have come to experience, this kind of disconnection epidemic, and the information needed to filter from their head to the heart. If we don't love something, we're not going to be moved to save it. And so this was quite a kind of shift in my understanding of what was needed at a much deeper level, rather than the kind of scratching around to protect a few more hectares every election cycle.
And what was going on for you emotionally and physically as you spent more and more time in the office in this role rather than out in nature?
Well, I was just starting to suffer what most people do when they spend too long on a computer, just a bit of burnout, not as physically embodied in the world, really feeling myself being quite exhausted by the constant pushing to kind of keep up the pressure for the campaign. Yeah, I got to a point where I really felt like I had nothing left to give. At the same time, I was starting to really question the overall project of activism and look at the deeper reasons for the human nature disconnection. I started studying modalities like deep ecology, did a month-long residential retreat with a woman called Joanna Macy, who's an incredible deep ecologist, and she's developed this body of work called The Work That Reconnects, which is all about linking personal change and social change and understanding humans as one part of the web of life. which was very powerful. And also a little later on, I attended my first course in what was called nature philosophy, which was a 5-day immersion in wilderness survival skills and bush skills and kind of shamanic spiritual understanding. That was really quite a game changer for me. This was trying to light fires by rubbing sticks together. This was learning the bush food. This was blindfolded out in the forest by myself at night in the freezing cold, trying to find my way back to the sound of a distant drum. Like, this was alive making. I felt myself wake up in a way that I hadn't remembered since those early days of blockading and hanging out in the forest. And it was this sense of coming home, like this sense of, this is a missing piece. This is my birthright. My birthright is to know the skills living on the land and to know the plant, be literate in nature, not just to intellectually know it, but to really know it, to weave direct relationships between myself and the wild world. That really was the start of quite a significant shift in my life towards my later 20s, which really precipitated my move into the year-long immersion. There was a couple of years between when I decided I had to go bush for a year, when I actually did. So I travelled over to the States for a couple of their summers and studied at a place called Tom Brown Jr.'s Tracking, Nature Awareness and Wilderness Survival School, which is in New Jersey of all places, but it's one of the largest and original schools of tracking and all the skills of wilderness survival living. So I steeped myself in that for quite a few months each year. Then really the preparation was cutting the ties that I had back home. So I quit my job. I left my partner of 5 years. I left my beautiful share house by the ocean in Newcastle, started pretty much tying up all the loose ends, as you can imagine. I ended up with absolutely no keys, which was quite liberating. So I really didn't want to have too much of my modern life. I wanted to be as free as possible of any commitments. Come January, early January 2010, I've just got a carload of swag and a few bits and pieces and a few boxes of food and some tools and saws, and off I go. And a great collection of knives too.
Yeah, very, very important when you're going to spend time out in the bush.
Yes,
Were there doubts? Was there self-doubt? Am I doing the right thing? What am I doing? That was coming up in the back of your mind at any point?
As the time grew closer, there was certainly a sense of, what am I really doing? The voices of some of the doubters in my family or community telling people the plan, and they were like, what? You're taking food in? Well, that's cheating. Whereas I had to really come to my own sense of rightness about what the journey was going to be, how I was actually going to be able to find my edge and test myself in the ways that I wanted to be tested, but yet not try and be some hero and do it all perfectly. So I wasn't by myself. It was a very loosely facilitated program. So we were on a private land block of about 100 acres that was surrounded by a national park. And there was 5 others who had also signed up to kind of be guinea pigs in a way to what we call an independent wilderness studies program. But it sounds much more formal than it was. It was really just a bunch of us who decided that we really wanted to put these skills into practice and live as simply as possible on the land. There was 6 of us all together. Not all of us ended up finishing the year. I knew 3 of the other participants, which was great and challenging. The structure was very little in a way. We had instructors come in for the first 6 months of the year every now and then and skill us up in everything from fire by friction, shelter building, bird language, tracking. We had an Indigenous elder come in and teach us all about bush food and medicinals, string making, pottery, all sorts of different skills. Then it was up to us to put them into practice, because really there was nothing else to do out there but play with these skills and sink deeper into the fact that there was nowhere to be, nothing we had to do except be one more creature creating our shelter and creating our habitat and finding our food and lighting our fires and keeping warm, observing the changing face of the bush over 4 seasons.
you guys lovingly titled the area where you were living for that year the Block. Can you describe the landscape of the Block for us?
The Block is a very unromantic title that doesn't really reflect the romance that did happen between me and that patch of forest. But when I arrived, I wasn't so enamoured with it. It was cheap land. It wasn't any good for farming. It was sandstone country. It had been quarried. It had been logged. There wasn't any timber that was good for loggers. It was scribbly gums and banksias and that kind of like dry western sandstone country, not the lush northern New South Wales towering rainforest that I thought it would be. Not what I was expecting. There was a beautiful paperbark lined creek and billabong that was just came to life-giving waters. Having that deep billabong to swim in and that paperbark creek to float down when it was flooding, it was just magical. And the bush itself grew on me. I found a beautiful spot for my shelter under some very old, what I called grandmother banksia trees, and some very old scribbly gums because they hadn't been taken by the loggers. So the scribbly gums were these old, gnarled, white, shining trees. All the kind of prickle and scratch that I first encountered turned into these friends and shrubs that would flower and fruit, and I discovered some of them were edible and that they were creekle feed trees for some of the birds that came through. And the banksias was just so delightful as well. Their presence was just so nurturing and nourishing, and I really felt like they held me in their gnarly old embrace that year.
You mentioned your shelter, and there's this really interesting story about building your shelter where you called in, it was kind of like phone a friend, phoned in your mum and dad to help you with building your shelter. Can you tell us that story?
I had these grand designs, what I wanted my shelter to look like, and we had about 2 months to build our shelter without power tools, without any metal, no nails, no hammer. And it took me a month to build myself a little simple lean-to that was going to be my kitchen. And the paperbark roof took way more paperbark than I imagined it would need to make it waterproof. Then the idea of building this grand design shelter became quite obviously a bit overambitious. I knew I couldn't do it on my own. So I quite reluctantly, in some ways, called my parents, who were busting to come up and visit me. They came up for maybe 5 days and helped me build a frame for what became my shelter. It was a very simple but profound igloo shape. I just knew I wanted to live in a circular dwelling. It was like building my little cocoon in a way. And it was quite a process building it with my parents because my dad and I are both stubborn with our own fixed ideas on how things are meant to go, and we clashed. I wanted to be quite slow and sacred about the whole thing. He's got more of a practical gung-ho, let's just do it attitude. But it was also quite a healing time for us, and we came to some new understanding of each other, and I certainly had such gratitude because I don't think I would have got my shelter built without them. They did leave me with the enormous task of thatching. They just helped me put up the frame and the chimney, but the thatching was what took hours and days and weeks because it was that process of pulling out the grass, bundling the grass, tying it onto the shelter with a couple of layers so that it actually was waterproof. When that first storm came and I ran inside to see if it was waterproof, and standing there in this shelter that I'd built with my own hands, I'd woven the string to tie on all the saplings and I'd bundled all the grass, and I was dry in this storm, and it was just an incredible feeling. I didn't move into my shelter. I was having too much fun sleeping in my kitchen because it was warm and I could kind of see the outdoors. I just thought, no, I think I'll just stay here for a while. And then one night I heard a scratching / slithering sound, and I fumbled around for my torch, switched it on, and to my horror, I saw a snake trying to get into my mosquito net. Suffice to say, I somehow flung myself out of my swag, watched as the snake made its way back into its home, which happened to be between the layers of the paperbark in my kitchen roof. So that was the night that I untied my mosquito net from the kitchen, and I rolled up my swag and I took it very unceremoniously into my shelter, rolled it out, and spent my first night in my shelter, and it was just so quiet and so contained and felt so safe. I thought, what have I been waiting for? It's really time to enter into the cocoon. So it was a physical shift into my shelter, but it also signified the coming of winter and a real shift of my attention to the internal landscape.
Your book is called A Year Without Matches. Why was going without matches for that whole time so important to you?
Lighting fires without matches was a very strong symbol for me of my independence and really finding the spark of my own life again. So I made a firm commitment to only light fires without matches the entire year. I also knew that if I had matches, I'd just be lazy and light fires with matches, and then I wouldn't learn how to light fire the traditional way. That really forced me into a intimate relationship with fire and with the skill required to make fire. And there was two methods I was using, the bow drill and called the hand drill, which is the traditional Australian way of spinning one stick onto a flat board and that friction creating the ember. In theory, I really desperately wanted to be able to make fire in the way that had been done on this land for thousands and thousands of years. There was something in the promise of that skill, in mastering that skill, that just felt so freeing, liberating, and my own power. But it took me 3 months before I could successfully make a coal with that method. I did use the bow drill for all my other fires. Luckily, I had a lovely flowing relationship with that fire making technique. But it was hand drill that really taught me so much about myself and about the element of fire. I tried so hard for months and discovered one night when I put a blindfold on and tried to light a fire without looking, at how far I was, without looking at the results. When I actually did light a fire with a blindfold on, I realized the key was not being so attached to the outcome, just enjoying the process itself. It's a great metaphor for life. It taught me to want something and to try, but that the striving gets in the way of the process. The striving is the obstacle to success.
From trying so much, you ended up with huge blisters on your hands. I was on your website the other day looking at the photos that are up there, and what I really noticed in your story was that this desire to want to let go, but really, really struggling with the process of just letting go, of just being, of just having the experience, and having those huge blisters on your hands as almost like a metaphor for clinging on so tightly.
I think it probably was more in hindsight, but I can absolutely see how it's a perfect metaphor. I went in there with a lot of expectations on myself and all the old conditioning around being a perfectionist, having to get things right, that there's a right way and a wrong way, and transferring the goal-oriented way that I approach life onto this project. So I started kind of making mental lists of all the skills I wanted to master and how I might do that, and realized that I was creating the same kind of busyness that I'd been wanting to escape from. And it was quite humbling to see how addicted I was to achieving, to doing, to striving, to needing something to show for my day, rather than just following impulse, following flow, following what I felt my body wanted to do. Little bit by little bit, I chipped away at that conditioning and gave myself more and more permission to just wander, which is actually what I did a lot of in winter, was just wandering without time or destination, letting myself just intuitively follow my body, where I wanted to be, when I wanted to sit, when I wanted to nap in the sun, when I wanted to eat. This is the essence of rewilding, this word that I've come to use to describe my work now, which is not so much about mastering the hard skills of survival, but more about embracing this wildness, which is our authenticity. What does this being need right now? What does this being want to do? What does this being feel like? What's going to serve right now? What's authentic? That's true wildness, not being able to make the most proficient hand drill in the world. So that's kind of what I was deconditioning myself and unlearning so that I could rediscover that essence.
Yeah, I think there's a point in the book where you start to realize that you weren't just there to learn skills and slow down, like you're saying, but you were actually there to actually really touched me. You said I was there to learn how to be a woman, a wild woman. Can you tell us about that journey of learning to become a woman?
I was reading Women Who Run with the Wolves when I was out there, which is just a fantastic invitation into the wild self. The whole year was really a rite of passage into that archetype of the wild woman, which is so underexpressed. So many women grow up being, the good girl, the one who says yes, who does everything at the expense of their own needs, who smiles and gets along, who plays the hostess, plays the good girlfriend or the good wife or the good mother, without really challenging what is my calling, what is my essence, what is my vision, and tapping into that wild Indigenous self that we all have. We're all Indigenous to the earth. For me, that year, the doorway to that entering that archetype was that intimacy with the elements, lighting my own fire, building my own shelter, carting my own water, finding food, being barefoot on the earth, having a very sensual relationship with the natural world, which brought back that instinctive wild nature within myself. I really identify that I had injured instincts, as do most of us growing up in a patriarchal culture. Our instincts are injured. We haven't grown up having a mirror to ourselves of we are adequate the way we are. We are wild creatures who have sovereignty over ourselves, and we know what we want and need at any time. We haven't been taught that. So this was about relearning that this creature is wild at its essence and deconditioning the good girl and the perfectionist into more of an integrated woman who can move through the world with greater clarity of who she is and what she has to offer. It really was like a recapitulation, like a kind of walking back over my life and unpicking all the knots of old beliefs and judgments about the way that I should be in the world. And it involved revisiting old traumas, revisiting wounds from the past of where I'd lost my power or given my power away, kind of reclaiming that birthright of sovereignty of self and sovereignty to the earth.
I spoke to, I'm not sure if you know or you've heard of Tara Rome. She's just walked 17,000 kilometres unassisted around the outside of Australia. And
oh, wow.
It's interesting because quite a lot of what you're saying here is very similar to what she was saying. And she talked about how nature and walking provided a space for all of that stuff to kind of come up and for her to process. Did you find that the forest facilitated that for you, that it acted as, it just facilitated it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's something about steeping oneself in wild nature. You don't have that constant reference point of the human world and the particular culture in which you're born. So there's more of this sense of just pure essence. The forest is always in flow. And so what I experienced was all the stuck places in myself just started to kind of shift and rattle around and water flow as well, which kind of looked like chaos sometimes. But the forest was definitely a healing balm. It mirrored back to me my true nature without any of the constraints and borders of the culture in which I was brought up. This is why for so many cultures, rites of passage and initiations and journeys of transformation are often alone in nature, because one encounters essence, because the wildness in nature mirrors back the wildness in self.
Did you ever feel lonely out there?
I did sometimes feel lonely, not a lot, because I was just so excited about being out there, but I loved the mornings, and as soon as I was by my fire in my shelter at night, I loved crafting and making my own string and weaving baskets by the fire at night. But sometimes in the afternoon, there'd just be this kind of creeping sense of loneliness and isolation that I just had to walk with, really. I wanted the challenge, I really wanted to find that edge. There was certainly times where I wished that there was hot water a hot shower would have been lovely, or kettles to make a hot cup of tea without having to burst my blisters to get a fire. The year itself was quite joyful. At the same time, it felt quite everyday. It was like, oh, this is just what I'm doing. It wasn't really until months or years later that I looked back and realised what a kind of a moment in time, what an opportunity and a privilege, how precious those days were.
When the year was over, were you ready to return to normal life?
I thought I was ready, and then I found it quite difficult to leave not just the bush, but the community that I'd been living in. I'd really experienced such deep connection to myself and to the earth and to the others. Even though we had all sorts of interpersonal challenges, there's this sense of tribe and of family and of these people really having my back. Returning to four walls and a kind of isolated culture, I experienced quite a lot of grief, like a kind of a homesickness, actually.
Did you think I should just go back out to the bush, or?
Oh, I often think that. It's almost a daily thought.
Why haven't you?
Oh, it's a good question. Once the book was published, it just kind of created this momentum. It seemed like the natural next step was to start offering those kinds of experiences to others and to teaching what I'd learnt. And ultimately, I'd like to be able to offer that year-long experience to others. I just have to find the right land, and then the possibility will be there. But yeah, for now, it just feels like I've got foot in both worlds, one foot still in the wild and one foot here in the city, serving and offering what I know.
How's your view of the forest changed? So when you look back at those early years when you were in grassroots activism to the experience that you had in the bush, how did that view of what the forest needed and what it actually was change for you?
I think the first line in my book is something like, I thought I knew the forest until we moved in together, and then I realised I knew nothing much at all. Yeah, it's one thing to go on a camping trip with all the mod cons, and another to really be reliant on the forest for your shelter and warmth, company. And it just feels like just like a friend that I miss when I'm not there. And I still think of my sit spot, the place that I sat every day and observed the forest around me. I miss that spot. The forest is not some intellectual idea or pretty picture on the wall, but a visceral embodied sense of a relationship of which I'm a part of it.
How have you changed?
I really feel like there's a kind of a before and an after, and it's still kind of hard to tangibly say what that is. I certainly feel like I entered in my youth and I left somewhat in my true adulthood. It was a rite of passage that I kind of surreptitiously created for myself. I feel more present. I feel more receptive. I feel more in my body. I feel like, in some ways, much more responsive to my environment. So my emotions are very much more at the forefront rather than being buried, I guess. It's not like a greater peace necessarily. It's more of a connection to what's authentically happening within me, a reciprocity between me and the world around me, which includes the human and the non-human world. There's a greater sense of listening, of gratitude and appreciation and curiosity. It's just really sparked my desire to want to know more.
When you look at the way that humans generally live life, what did that experience teach you about the way we're currently doing life?
Well, it's just brought it home so much more clearly to me that we're just living an absolute bubble of disconnection that's fueling an ecological crisis. And unless we find a way to reconnect and reclaim our birthright, because we're struggling, I just see the epidemic of isolation and disconnection as causing so much suffering. I just see the suffering in a way I never did before. The antidote to that is connection. And it's the connection not just to nature, but to ourselves and to rebuilding a sense of village community, village culture. And that's what's going to really renew our culture from the ground up.
For more information about Claire Dunn and her year without matches, head to the show notes at alanahelbig.com/episode 30. Thank you so much again for listening. What a season it's been. Bye for now.